Hey,
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome everyone. My name is John Tabone and I work in marketing research at the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada. I also serve as a member of the Client Side Research Council, or CSRC. I'll be moderating today's session, and to start, I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today. I'm pleased to say that we have over 70 registrants for today's session, and I'll introduce our speaker in just a moment. But before I do that, I just want to encourage you and remind you that you can ask questions at any time during the presentation, and there will be a formal Q&A at the end of the presentation. You can do that by submitting questions using the Ask a Question function in GoToWebinar. I'm now pleased to introduce today's speaker, Mark Woods. Mark has worked on the supply side of research for over 20 years and is currently the Vice President at TNS Canadian Facts, where he's worked for for 3 years. He is also Vice Chair of the MRIA Board of Directors, and more importantly for today's discussion, he is also the Chair of the Standards Committee. Please join me in welcoming Mark Woods.
Thanks, John. Much appreciated. Thanks, everybody, for joining us on today's Standards Refresher for client-side researchers. So I'm just going to walk through the agenda of what we're going to cover today. So first thing is, probably most importantly, is why do we need standards? We're also going to review some of the MRA code and changes from the previous code, as that was recently updated in January of this year. We're going to also talk about some topics of interest: response rate, margin of error, privacy issues, the do not call list, and as well as some new legislation that has been enacted and potentially could be enacted in the future. So common questions that we get in terms of the Standards Committee and from members: what the Standards Committee plans are for 2015 and 2016 to show you the breadth of work that we are currently engaging in, how you guys can help, and then we'll take some questions. So first of all, what is the importance of standards? Well, thinking generally and outside of the market research world, they are the fundamental building blocks for ensuring consistent application of principles and protocols. They allow for goods and services to be universally understood and adopted, and make it easier for comparisons, especially when everybody's playing on a level playing field. This becomes very important when you're talking about things on a global stage. Specifically for our case, the MRIA code is used to foster public confidence and demonstrate practitioner recognition of their ethical and professional responsibilities. It is intended to reflect the standard of best practice in Canada, providing explicit assurance of consumer protection in terms of how the industry interacts with and serves the Canadian public, ultimately respecting the public's rights as a respondent. With the code in place, all market research companies must play on a level playing field and conduct their business ethically, this thus providing a basic check and balance system. Without the code, the industry becomes a quote-unquote Wild West, with everybody doing what they want, treating respondents in any way they want as long as the data is collected. As I was preparing for this presentation, I was fortunate enough to visit the Magna Carta exhibit that was being displayed at Fort York in Toronto, showing this most important historical document. I apologize for the subpar photography, but this is the best that is allowed at that time during the exhibit. So just a quick history lesson. After a significant revolt about sovereign power, the Magna Carta was first signed by King John of England in 1215 and established that everybody, including the king, was subject to the rule of law. This historic document is at the foundation of key human rights and legal documents, including our own Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Now, this comparison by no means is intended to draw parallels or a comparison to the MRA Code of Conduct, but nevertheless, there are some parallels with this document. The Magna Carta empowered citizens to hold the government accountable and has been the foundation for many of the documents that build trust, credibility, and legitimacy among Canadians. Again, the document was meant to hold someone accountable and be the foundation of building trust, credibility, and legitimacy. The MRIA code holds practitioners accountable to adhering to the professional and ethical responsibilities. With these standards in place, it allows us to build trust, credibility, and legitimacy among the Canadian public about the work that we do. So definitely, our standards are important to the livelihood of our industry. And if that wasn't enough to underscore the importance of our standards, our membership adds that final piece of evidence. These are the scores from the 2015 MRIA Benefits Survey, and the summary report is available on our website. And I highly suggest each of you to read through this document. But the Code of Conduct is by far the highest rated benefit that our members consider the MRA to provide. Secondly, what is the purpose of standards? Well, really, it allows us to operate in a self-regulatory environment. The code, along with some other important elements with how we interact with the public, which we'll speak about later, fulfills the objectives of our industry in having the necessary framework to allow for self-regulation. That is, it allows us to minimize the need for any governmental legislation or regulation with respect to industry practices and activities. Without that code, a government agency who likely has limited knowledge or concerns of our industry will be tasked to ensure the public is protected, and this could severely hamper how we collect data. However, with the code, the public's confidence in market research is enhanced as it emphasizes the rights and safeguards to which they are entitled. It provides explicit assurance of consumer protection in how our industry interacts with and serves the Canadian public. Finally, the reason we need standards is related to caveat emptor, or buyer beware. Kara Mitchell-Moore, the MRIA CEO, recently wrote a blog post about this very subject a few weeks ago, and I suggest those who haven't read it, read it soon. As a summary of the post, client-side researchers need to be aware of and knowledgeable about our standards and hold your suppliers accountable to them. This will ensure that you receive the best quality and be confident in the decisions that are being made on the back of that data. The code not only addresses the responsibilities of researchers to each other and to the public, but also anyone benefiting from research and the decisions made from it. This is not something you should assume your suppliers are following. You need to ask questions. Ensure that your agencies follow the code should definitely be a priority for you. If you have any questions, obviously you can contact the MRA office and they'll be happy to help interpret or how you can apply those rules. So referencing the Magna Carta again, this document was updated successfully as clauses were interpreted, reworded, or removed. These updates to the Magna Carta were necessary to reflect the changing environment. This is really no different from the MRA code, as our code needs to be updated to reflect the changes in methodologies, practices, and the like as things evolve through the advance of technology. However, this was not always done, and as it should have been prior to the most recent update in January, as the last update that we had was in 2007. Needless to say, just the difference in the way that online research was conducted 8 years ago was justification for the update. Now there is prevalence of social media, mobile research, and passive research that require standards for our industry. With all the changes that have occurred, as well as what could be next, the MRA decided that it was best to leverage on global resources to provide regular updates on standards in developing or rapidly advancing methodologies or practice areas. Therefore, the MRA Board of Directors agreed to adopt the SMR Code. This now aligns us with the principles of the SMR Code of International Market and Social Research and the vast number of specific areas covered. But importantly, aligning to this code allows us to leverage the resources of SMR to ensure our standards stay up to date moving forward, and that it is not 2023 when we review them again. Now, needless to say, there's some caveats. It is not simply just posting the SMR code to our website and calling it a day. The SMR code is designed for global market research practice and does not cover specific practice within each jurisdiction or geography around the world. In order to ensure the document is relevant for Canadian researchers, the implementation in January required that my predecessor as standards chair reviewed and revised elements of the document to reflect any specific legacy elements or applicable laws that reflect how we actually conduct market research in Canada. I've called this process the Canadianization of the code. In the future, as SMR updates or amends codes or appendices, the same review process will be taken to ensure that we have current and robust global standards, but are specifically applicable to the Canadian landscape. So we're going to go through now what has changed and what has not changed. but really what I want to focus on is what has not changed. And the important part is that the Charter of Respondent Rights, which has been an ongoing thing with the MRA for a number of years, that has not changed at all. And much like the Magna Carta, it's certainly how we hold ourselves accountable to the Canadian public. The SMR Code does not include this Charter of Respondent Rights, so that is certainly why we have retained it. And remember, without the respondents' trust in our industry, what will we have? And yes, I realize that there are more and more data sources being used now to collect data, but those sources cannot answer all of your questions. We do need to go to the public. So what has not changed? The Respondent Charter of Rights. What has changed? There are a number of similarities with our old code. The new code is not exactly the same. The most notable difference is the structure, and it is now principle-based, moving away from the more prescriptive nature of the old MRIA code. However, all of the same areas, such as following honesty and professional responsibility, are covered in the overarching code. What also has changed is that there are now a number of appendices that cover specific types of research or methodology. Many of these were not covered in our previous codes, such as social media, or mobile, or out of date in the case of passive measurement. SMR also does not have a qualitative code, and that is certainly one Canadianization that we have retained here, is that ensuring that there is a qualitative code for research in Canada. Another big change was the definition of a child. It's also been aligned to global definitions, with children being classed as those under 14 years. Previously, it was 13 and under. In addition, this code, specifically related to children, has been added to include persons with functional cognitive disabilities. And finally, the complaints process was also revamped and includes mandatory non-disclosure for both parties, prescriptive sanctions, and a defined and a much shorter timeline to make this whole process much more efficient. So let's go into the overarching code in more detail before tackling a couple of the appendices. The code actually covers 16 different principles, each with several clauses, ranging from professional responsibility to published findings to data protection to the complaints process. As an example, here are one of the clauses, the first clause related to basic principles, in such that market research shall be legal, truthful, and objective, and be carried out in accordance with established and appropriate scientific principles. This is just talking about the basic principles of doing good research. As I've mentioned, we also have a much deeper code. And so aside from that generic code, there are 14 specific appendices that cover different types of research, different types of situations that are required standards. Included among others already mentioned include the integrity of reporting, how we report results, whether to clients or in the media, the commissioning of research, mystery shopping, distinguishing market research activities from other data collection activities, public opinion polling, expert evidence, and mutual rights and responsibilities of researchers and clients. So let's go into a couple specific areas of the code. The first one I'm going to dive into is the social media research code. As you can see, it's a 7-page document dedicated strictly to social media research. And while the principles of the overarching code certainly are injected throughout these appendices, there is a scope in each of the documents that specifically relates to the research that they are discussing. In this case, the code covers the collection of social media data for market, opinion, and social research purposes. It recognizes that there are many different activities enabled by social media, of which market, opinion, or social research is just one. And that these are varied activities, including customer service and customer relationship management, necessarily and have different implications for consumers and those who make use of social media. So rather than it being very general as the overarching code is, this is very specific and deals with anything that has to do with social media research. As I've mentioned, that there are principles in there that are specific to social media research. And it obviously covers a number of definitions specific to social media research, such as masking. a technique whereby the original social media data such as comments, photos, or videos are altered to a point that the information cannot be traced back or attributed to the original user. Or a walled garden, which is an online service that requires users to register or apply for membership before being permitted to participate and can only be accessed after the user has obtained a login and/or password. While all the core principles of the MRIA code, as I've mentioned, apply to social media research, this document covers specific implications of the core principles as applied to social media research. It also covers best practices depending on the type of social media that is being surveyed, whether it's public social media, private social media, and market research social media. So whereas before, prior to January of this year, the MRIA had little guidance in terms of conducting best practices, the standard of social media research. Now we have a 7-page document that will help anybody with social media research in the future. The next one we're going to look at is mobile. Similarly to the social media research, this is another specific appendix, an 8-page document that covers mobile research only. It also covers specific issues related to mobile market research, such as the need for participant consent before software is downloaded to a device, the fact that pictures or video are personally identifiable information and should be treated with care, and that incidental data from the device, such as logs of calls made or GPS coordinates, are not to be used for anything but research-related purposes, as well as an appropriate design in terms of length of interview and layout, adapted device for different devices. So while not only providing principles about how to follow market research, there's also some best practices about what you should design your surveys for in terms of mobile market research. And the final section of the code that I'm going to highlight has specific relevance for those on the call today. This document provides interpretation of the specific principles in the code when filtered down to the buyer-supplier relationship. And this covers areas such as ownership of documents, who owns what in the process, and covers proposals, cost quotes, results, and syndicated research. Subcontracting. Suppliers need to be transparent with clients about who is being subcontracted and where those people are located. Validation and quality checks are required for data collection and data preparation. The keeping of records in terms of the study materials, should there be a need to go back. Publish findings, ensuring that research findings are not misleading or misinterpreted. Technical information that should be included in all the reports. And what happens when there are substantial alterations in timing, costs, and specifications. Finally, some responsibility for products and stimuli, and really ensuring that there's no harm comes to, or no harm or adverse effects comes to our respondents. So overall, the examples presented shows the level of detail and specificity covered in the overall code and the specific appendices of that. And I think that we can also agree that compared to the past, these are much deeper and much more relevant and robust than any MRIA code has been. So now let's move on to other elements of the MRIA Standards Committee beyond just the code. The response rate. Response rate is a metric that assesses the level of non-response bias that could be in your sample. The response rate calculation has not changed, and the MRIA adopted the same method as recommended by Statistics Canada. Typically, response rates are associated with fixed sample that ends with a conclusion of a complete or refusal, while convenience samples work differently where terms like cooperation rate or completion rate are used, which are more rudimentary with the number of completes divided by the total number of interviews started or total number of invites sent. Margin of error is certainly one that comes up regularly. MRIA's position is that margin of error cannot be given to results that arise from a non-probability-based sample, as the statistics are not applicable to these groups. A quick lesson on sampling theory is that a sub-selection of a population can be surveyed and represent the whole population, assuming a number of criteria have been met, such as random selection, equal probability of participation, etc. With the margin of error used to assess the expected difference between the true population and the sample estimate of that subpopulation. Large margins of errors indicate that the survey results are less likely to be representative of the metric. In the past, this metric has been used as a quality marker to assess the confidence one places in the data. I'm sure many have seen results that are plus or minus 3% at the 95% confidence interval, and that is what the margin of error is. Well, the margin of error was great for phone and door-to-door samples back in the day when probability samples were true probability samples. Everybody had an equal chance to participate. That is not the case nowadays. Even with random phone samples, as not everybody has a landline or answers their phones, we still need to include these in the application. But I think what we need to do now is we need to change the conversation away from margin of error. Some companies have filled in their own gaps using statements like, if this is a probability sample, then the margin of error could have been plus or minus X at a percent of confidence interval. Or others have developed their other measures using Bayesian statistics. But as I've mentioned, we need to change the conversation from whether margin of error is applicable, relevant, or even correct today, and focus on developing other marks of quality that can be applied to research projects. And needless to say, this is just not a Canadian issue. This happens all around the world. And discussions have happened at SMR conferences as well as around the globe and within local MRI associations. And we are helping drive those discussions on a global stage and are working on some initiatives involving other associations such as SMR, the MRS in England, and the AMSRS in Australia, just to name a few, as well as some academics from Stanford. So stay tuned with margin of error. A couple other points on privacy and the do not call list. The do not call list, the DNCL, gives consumers a choice about whether to receive telemarketing calls. Consumers can choose to reduce the number of telemarketing calls by registering the residential, wireless, or any other telephone number on the national do not call list. Now, needless to say, there are several exemptions, such as charities and political parties, or businesses where you had an existing relationship. Specifically for our interests, calls made solely for the purpose of market research are also exempt. These types of calls are not telemarketing calls because they are not asking you to purchase, lease, or rent products or services. This is where the classification of mugging or sugging is important, or clearly distinguishing a research practice from a marketing practice. Privacy is certainly a topic we get a fair number of questions on, rightfully so, as it is extremely huge, an extremely important topic. CASL, the anti-spam legislation that came into force last year, prompted more focus on this topic. However, for those on the call who conduct research among their customers, this should be front and center in your organization. The handling of customers' personally identifiable information, PII, internally and externally when contracting with suppliers is paramount. And I suggest all of those who do customer-based research to see how your suppliers handle your customer records and ensure the safeguards they place on this highly sensitive data is applicable for your organization. These are certainly not files that just should simply be passed back and forth via email. And finally, in terms of privacy, a number of years ago when privacy policies were first developed, the Canadian MR Market Research Association developed a handbook to help our member companies navigate through these tricky waters for providing interpretations on privacy laws, best practices, and schedules and legal documents for handling and transferring your personally identifiable information. Needless to say, there have been a number of developments since this document was developed, and the MRA is planning on updating it in early 2016. So what is coming up in the future? What do we see on the horizon? So over recent time, there has been some new legislation passed that impacts how we conduct our research, and potentially some upcoming changes that will further impact how we collect data. The first was the Fair Elections Act. It was announced by the CRTC just before this most recent federal election was called to inform the legal requirements regarding the voter contact registry are now in effect. Basically, this Fair Elections Act required anyone using the services of a call service provider to make calls to voters during the election had to register with the CRTC at least 48 hours prior to making the first call. The calling service provider also had to register with the CRTC and include anyone using an automated dialing and announcing device. Secondly, The TCPA is the U.S.'s Telephone Consumer Protection Act that regulates telemarketing calls to consumers. In July of this year, the TCPA was updated such that prior consent to use an automated telephone dialing system, also known as autodialers, to call cell phones. The change required prior consent from anybody making calls using an autodialer to the respondent of the cell phone to make that call again. That is, the change required prior consent from respondents before the call could be made to their cell phone. Accidental dials were not an excuse, and fines were based on a per-call basis. Needless to say, autodialers have become an important part of survey and opinion research as it reduces the time it takes to dial a number manually and eliminates any chance of dialing. But I must point out again, this is a U.S. law, and several large fines have already been levied as a result. Depending on the CRTC's view of the application, there could possibly be grounds for them to open up consultations here in Canada about the similar practices. Now, while talking about the CRTC, we know that they have started a public consultation in the summer to better understand the technical solutions currently offered to help Canadians manage unsolicited telecommunications and illegitimate telemarketing calls. The CRTC is also exploring new and innovative solutions that could enhance consumer protections, including those that may reduce illegitimate caller identification spoofing. The information that's being gathered as part of this proceeding will serve to develop guidance for Canadians so that they can better manage unsolicited telecommunications and illegitimate telemarketing calls to ultimately protect their privacy. Now, this could impact our industry, and we will remain on top of this and provide further notice to our members as soon as further information is available. And finally, the long-form census. The census process, as many of you will likely know, was revised by the Conservative government before the last census was taken in 2011. And to be honest, I thought I would have had a lot more to talk about this, but Prime Minister Trudeau, after seeing the open letter from the MRIA, immediately made good on an election promise to restore the mandatory long-form consensus. So what kind of questions do we get from members? Well, only being on the job, so to speak, since June, there have been a number of questions asked of the Standards Committee by the membership, and they primarily fallen into three buckets. Privacy. Privacy questions are the most popular ones that come up, but having updated the handbook and the schedules should be a large help to MRA companies, and they'll have better guidance for operating to ensuring private information stays private. However, they can always rely on the resources of the MRIA office to interpret anything further. Specific methodologies, another question that we get is clients asking for out-of-the-box research. Does it fall within the code? Those certain questions come up quite often. And then finally, election 2015, where seemingly some members of the general public became extremely knowledgeable about surveying and sampling theory and raised intellectual questions about the methodology or results of polls. Well, each of these were diligently followed up by the MRA. In all cases, these members of the general public were clearly affiliated with a political party and were just trying to poke holes in polls where their party was not at favor. So on to the Standards Committee from 2015 to 2016 and the work that we've got upcoming for this year. So right now the committee consists of 7 members representing a variety of different company types and geographies. And over the course of the year, we're going to tackle a number of different subjects such as Canadianizing the polling standards. Currently, the SMR has WAPOR-based standards. We are currently reviewing those, and we'll have a Canadianized version in early next year. We're also updating the qualitative code and refreshing it to ensure that there's no inconsistencies. We're spending some more time to beef up the disciplinary process in terms of adding some more teeth to break the code. The online market research code, that is currently being reviewed by SMR, and we've seen several drafts of the review and provided comments on that, and that will be coming out in the near future. Sweepstakes guidelines for research suppliers, finding rules about how to conduct sweepstakes for providing incentives for respondents has always been a challenge. The MRIA developed a document for a value-added service and provides members some guidelines in terms of best running sweepstakes. Margin of error, I've already talked about that, and we continue to be involved in discussions about margin of error. Gold Seal certification process revamp. This is specifically related to your research suppliers. After going through a certification process, they become Gold Seal certified to uphold the standards and follow and be audited to follow the ethical and professional responsibilities of the MRIA. We are currently going under a review process, aligning the certification to our new standards and ultimately beefing up that document and the process overall. ISO standards, while the SMR and now adopted MRA code are ethical-based standards, ISO standards fall more under the quality framework, and the MRA Board of Directors recently endorsed the ISO standards, and we will slowly be injecting some of the ISO quality-based standards into the Gold Seal certification process after a point in time when companies can abide. The Privacy Handbook, I've already spoken about. Access panel certification review in terms of looking at different ways that we can certify access panels to provide a mark of quality. We're also in conversation with ePHEMRA, which is the Market Research Association for Pharmaceuticals, about adopting their code. And then finally, each of the appendices that I presented before have a champion on the Standards Committee who is responsible for staying abreast of developments in that arena, understanding the implications of those and bringing those to the committee so that we can keep the appendices refreshed and up to date as much as possible. And finally, how can you help? First, I suggest you all read the code. It is a long document, does not provide for good bedtime reading unless you want to get to sleep quickly, but there is certainly a lot of important elements within that. Also, question your agency. If it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. And if you're unsure, contact the MRIA. And this is where I'm going to step on my soapbox for a few minutes, but I certainly would advocate for all of those to partner with MRIA Gold Seal agencies. These have been through a certification process and ensures that each of them uphold the standards and that all of their staff are aware of and understand that code. And finally, ensure your agencies are aware of two important research registration systems that the MRIA manages. The quantitative studies use the RSS, the Research Registration System. The system ensures that every quant study conducted, regardless of method, is registered in the MRA system. Should any respondent question the legitimacy of a survey or have a complaint to make, this is the mechanism to allow consumers a feedback system to provide a check on our industry. This is one of the most important processes aside from our code that allows us to maintain our self-regulation framework. And the QRR, the Qualitative Research Registry, was created to handle those who do not or should not be contacted when recruiting for qual studies. This is really a comprehensive internal do not call list that will include not only those who have participated in qualitative studies recently, but also those who have been asked not to be contacted further, and those felt by research recruiters and moderators to be best served by not being included in further research. In the end, it ensures the best sample for all of your qual studies. Again, when sending out your next RFP, ask your suppliers if they register on them with either the QRR and the RRS. And finally, obviously stay MRA members. The membership drive is currently ongoing for 2016. By being part of the MRA membership, you will be able to join these fantastic webinars and learn more about standards. So on that note, I'll open it up to questions.
Great, thank you, Mark. I've got a couple of questions, but before I get to them, I just want to remind you again that you can use the question and answer feature within YouTube meeting to submit any questions that you have. We but we definitely have some time for more than that. I'm going to start with a question on the margin of error. You mentioned that that's kind of going away, but is there something that's going to replace it if you want to provide evidence of the reliability of a survey? And can you provide some feedback on that?
Well, yes, the margin of error will not go away because it is still a relevant statistic. It's just about what relevant metrics can be used to determine the quality of the survey on non-probability based samples. Those are the discussions that we're going on right now, and we're building in the bigger pool of people, the global pool, as well as including some academics. So at this point, I can't provide any details about what that may be. Suffice it to say that that's being worked on, and it's an important initiative that we want to make sure that gets out as soon as we can. But recognizing that it will take some time to develop a process, a metric that people will buy into.
Okay, the next question, is there any areas, particularly on the client side, where you find that either if they're doing it internally or just maybe not monitoring their own suppliers, where they're maybe starting to get into a gray or even maybe stepping the lines where they're maybe not in compliance with some of the standards? Are there particular areas where you've noticed that?
I have not noticed anything specifically, but again, we get calls, or not calls, but questions from our agencies quite often about different things that they're doing, what a client may ask of them, but it comes back to us. We provide some interpretation of it, and they can take it from there. I don't think that there's a lot of cases that is happening, but it's more those pushing it, a little bit further to the outside of the box.
Okay. Is there any examples you can give without maybe identifying anyone, or does it start to get too identifying when you do that?
Yeah, as soon as we start talking about it, it becomes quite noticeable about what we're talking about, what the potential industry is, and potentially what even the study is about.
Okay, that's fair. So I've got one more question so far, and again, as I mentioned, there is time for more. You talked a little bit about the RSS and the QRR. Is it a requirement that all research go through that, or is there certain research that should definitely be, and maybe others that is less important? Can you talk a little bit about where that needs to be and what it should be used, and maybe when it may not be as important?
Right. First of all, it's important for every research study that you do, and whether it's a probability-based sample, a random sample, where you're not using access panels as well as using access panels, even though I know that they have a double opt-in or a triple opt-in process that everybody should be aware of the need or the ability of them to conduct research. So I certainly think that they should be registered for every single study that is being done. It is mandatory as Gold Seal agencies that all studies need to be registered through the QRR and the RRS. So if you deal with any Gold Seal agency, they should be registering that. And again, this is an important mechanism for if a consumer, if a respondent is unsure about the legitimacy of the survey, and this is particularly the case when they're being asked about sensitive questions, whether it's a sensitive topic, or then you get into the financial questions, whether about income or investments, people will always then start the hair on the back of their neck raises, and they think, well, why are they asking me this question? Who's going to have access to this information? And at that point, if the person on the phone or if the agency has a mechanism to provide third-party information that can be confirm the validation of the validity of the surveys is certainly important. And I'll also bring that back to a case several years ago in terms of convenience panels or access panels, is that a member of an access panel contacted the Privacy Commissioner several years ago because the access panel sent this person a birthday greeting because it was their birthday, and the person was alarmed to the fact that they knew when his birthday was. So he contacted the Privacy Commissioner, and this is just even with people on an access panel who expect to be surveyed. We're unsure about the information that is given, and without this feedback or the checkback system, this could potentially harm our industry.
I got a question that ties right into that. Are the standards that are being developed for access panels only for panels run by suppliers, or I'm not doing the rest of the question, but I guess the rest of the question is, or would they apply to maybe client panels or panels run by non-research companies? What's your response to that?
So the standards are MRIA standards, and we feel that these are the quality, what you need to do legitimate research in whichever frame. So if it's an access panel that you're using for data, I would certainly want to make sure that all the standards of the MRIA have been followed through, whether it is an internal panel, a community panel, or somebody that's not even a member. But the important part is that for those non-members of the MRIA, they don't have to follow our code. That is not one of the requirements, and I always question why somebody would not be a member and would not want to follow our code. And I would then question some of the data that they may be getting from it. How are these panels recruited? How are the members, the panelists incentivized? All the different pieces that, it's not send them an invitation every single day to try and get a survey. So it's the management of the process as well that needs to be taken into consideration. And if you just do that without looking at various guidelines or best practices, I feel that you could really do harm.
Now, the next question is, where do big data and analytics fall within these standards? Is it within the scope of our standards?
No. So that, other than on the privacy-related issue, those pieces would not be included. There is measured elements in passive, but passive measurement, but that is more about the mechanics about best practices for measuring passively. It's not about the data that you will get from the millions and millions of transactional data or other pieces of data that you have. But I can certainly look into what other jurisdictions are doing in terms of the big data and data analytics.
Okay, well, the next question kind of ties into that, just maybe there's a little different angle on it. But as a client-side research, I'm getting more pressure to sort of build a database profile for our marketing efforts based on questions we're asking in the survey. How far can I go before that starts to violate standards, or is that allowed at all?
I guess it would depend on what information that you're compiling. If it's from all your internal surveys, then you're likely getting aggregated data or at least unidentifiable data. So there should be limit, but not significant limits in terms of what you should be able to do. But it's always looking back at the privacy and it's collecting the information and what it's going to be used for, and making sure that the information that you're using is only to be used for market research purposes. It's not meant for marketing purposes. And that's where the draw, when you're talking about detailed information at the respondent level, that's the case. Obviously, all the data that you collect is for marketing purposes, but at an aggregate level. But I could certainly, depending on that question, we could certainly take that up offline if that person would like to follow up.
Okay. The final question at this point, it doesn't clear us anymore. The final question at this point, you did mention a little bit about the Gold Seal registration system. I'm working with some smaller companies that are MRA members, but say the Gold Seal registration service isn't really relevant to companies of their size. Can you comment on that? Is it relevant to all suppliers, or is it more geared to a bigger supplier?
Oh no, they are certainly geared to all suppliers. The Gold Seal, when it was originally developed many years ago, was primarily the bigger companies. Over the last several years, that has been expanded to any research supplier can become a Gold Seal. The restrictions have been lessened, and I think any company can be a Gold Seal. But it is certainly important that every single survey that you do is registered, and even those who are not Gold Seal have the ability to register their surveys through the RRS or the QRR, even though they are not Gold Seal members. And again, it's just a protection for the company. It's a protection for our respondents to make sure that everybody understands that the surveys that are being done are legitimate.
Okay, what if I'm a client-side researcher and I'm not using a supplier? Can I use those registration systems as well? And how would I go about doing that?
Good question. I would have to follow up with you on that.
Okay. And we did get one more, and again, this I'm not sure you'll be able to answer on the spot, but maybe this is something we can provide afterwards. The question is, does MRA recommend any specific software or approaches for the secure transfer of customer data between clients and suppliers?
Yes, we will have to get back to you on that.
That's what I expected. Now, one more just came in, if you give me a minute. This next question is, do you think there's going to be a move to requiring that respondent data be stored in Canada? Some provinces seem to require this.
There are a number of government agencies, financial institutions as well, that require all of their research that resides in Canada, and this is particularly important when you're dealing with global access panel agencies that may have servers in other parts of the world. I don't know if it goes down on a provincial level, but I certainly know in a number of cases that data has to reside in Canada and has to stay in Canada and cannot go anywhere else.
I'm not seeing any more questions, but did want to thank you, Mark. This was a very informative session based on the questions. I think we had some very engaged members, certainly in some of the topics that you discussed. So again, I wanted to thank you for this excellent presentation, and I have to admit I probably need to take as you recommended, a review of the MRA standards, because it's been a little while since I'd gone through to them, and there's definitely some new things and some things coming down the pipeline that I wasn't aware of, so I definitely appreciate your time. I'd also like to thank everyone who participated in the webinar. Hope you found it as valuable to me as valuable as I did. That does bring us to the end of the session, and if you have any suggestions on topics for future webinars, I definitely encourage you to email me or the MRA office for future virtual connects that the CSRC board can offer. Thank you.